All right, here we go. Welcome to session two of the looking at the signs of John. I just noticed that I put session one here, so that real quick. Yeah, so we are looking at the Gospel of John, if you're not aware, and what we're doing, if you haven't seen a previous session, and what we're doing is we're looking at first we're going to be looking at the signs or seven miracles recorded by John, and we're discussing, the purpose of the Gospel of John, who he's writing to, how the signs apply, what they mean, so on and so forth. And that's what we're doing in the morning sessions now at 11 o'clock, and in the evening, be doing gaming sessions where we can discuss the passage maybe in a more practical way, application, also from a perspective of a child, which my daughter is, and who we'll be playing with on most occasions. Occasionally, my wife might jump in, especially if my daughter's like, I'm kind of getting tired of doing this streaming stuff. So we'll see. But what we're looking at today is John chapter 4. So if you want to read along or just kind of follow along with the screen I have up here, John chapter 4, starting in verse 43. Says, after the 2 days, he went on from there and into the Galilee. Now, Yeshua himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in his own country. But when he came into the Galilee, they welcomed him, for they had seen all he had done in the feast of Jerusalem, since they had also gone up to celebrate. So he went again to Cana of Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. Now there was a nobleman whose son was sick in Capernaum. When he heard that Yeshua had come from Judea to the Galilee, he went to him and begged him to come down and heal his son, for he was about to die. Then Yeshua said to him, unless you all see signs and wonders, you'll never believe. The nobleman said to him, Sir, come down before my child dies. Yeshua tells him, Go, your son lives. The man believed the word of Yeshua the man believed the word that Yeshua said to him and started off. While on his way down, his servants met him, saying that his son was living. So he asked them the hour when the boy began to get better. They said, the fever left him yesterday at about the seventh hour. Then the father realized that it was the same hour Yeshua said to him, Your son lives. Now he himself believed, along with his whole household. Yeshua did this as the second sign after he had come again from Judea into the Galilee. So, what's interesting here and to remember is that John's gospel is written a little differently than the other three. In typically the other three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are known as the synoptics, meaning they share a single view or a similar view. And in fact, when you do the breakdown of the different gospels and you talk about source material, uh, the content that's in Mark is repeated often in Matthew and Luke. So it's kind of like, Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark was written first, although there are those who believe in this document Q, which is kind of like this anonymous document that theoretically existed out there, something that Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John all copied it from certain stories or whatever. So that's a common idea that's out there among religious scholars, not necessarily uh, something that's discounted, just something that's understood in the terms of you're writing documents and historical documents, and yes, we talk about the Holy Spirit guiding, leading people, but at the same time, there's a practical side to the writing of these documents and these narratives. I mean, Luke talks about it in the beginning of his gospel and the beginning of Acts, how he went ahead and compiled eyewitness testimony and he did research into the writing of his material. So it's not outside of the realm possibility that there was an extra document that they all relied on, because memories and fail or whatever. You're just trying to do a good job, right? But the idea is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the three synoptics, and that they share a single view in that the way that they present the gospel, the story is pretty consistent. And John's always stood out from those three because his perspective, uh, it looks different. And one of the ways it looks different, we talked about this yesterday, is how John, who John is writing to, and how John seems to be going out of his way to make sure they felt welcomed by this gospel. Okay, and we see evidence of that here in this story and in this narrative. But yesterday, I just want to review real quick in John chapter 1, verses 43 to 51. That's the end of the chapter. John is recounting the story about how Jesus met Nathanael, and uh, the whole interaction starts with Philip, another disciple, going to Nathanael and telling him, I think that they're brothers, that we found the one Moses talks about in the law. So basically, we found the Messiah, the one who's prophesied about is Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth. And Nathanael asks the question, can anything good come from Nazareth? That's kind of the idea here that Nazareth is located in the region known as Galilee, and Galilee was in the northern part of the nation of Israel. And so there was like this, feeling that this area, this region, didn't really excel in producing good, honest, faithful Jewish people. Okay, and it's tied into their history. As we talked about that yesterday, their history, and that when the kingdom first split after Solomon, died and his son took over, and then the kingdom split into two, the northern kingdom was pretty quick to uh, turn to idolatry, and it's something Jeroboam did to make sure people didn't travel back to Jerusalem. I think he was worried about them going back to Jerusalem and worshiping the temple, and then being like, you know what, we should be united with the south. And so he created a place for them to worship up in the northern parts, and then they were the ones that were first conquered by an outside nation, those the Assyrians, and the Assyrians, like, then their way of conquering people was to intermingle, to have babies with the people that they took over, and to mix their bloodline, so that over time the people just kind of lose their own identity, and they associate with the Assyrian nation. That was where their method of conquering was. And so, by the time we're looking at this region now, that's why Nathaniel says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Because he's repeating that idea out of Galilee, out of the north. Like, those people have been mixed, and they've been blended up, and they've got different ideas about worship. At least that was the 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 thinking, produced by the Jewish elite, the Judeans in the south. And in that interaction, going back to John chapter 1, Jesus tells Nathaniel, like, he goes, "Oh, look, here comes someone, is it an Israelite in whom there's no deceit," right? And that's his audience. John is talking to the Israelite who has not fallen into the deceit of all the other stuff. That despite all this history, they've still been faithful to Moses and the law, and they may not worship at the temple, but they're still in Jerusalem. Uh, but they still are faithful to the law. So they still have their sacrifices, everything else, which they're doing in their own synagogues. And just as from this idea that, then Nathanael responds, "How do you know me?" And Jesus said, "Before Philip called you, I saw you standing under a fig tree." So there, it's, Jesus is sharing this divine ability to see somebody way away from them before they've even met, to know what they're doing, what they're thinking, or where they're standing, or whatever. Right? That's in itself it's a miracle, right? And Nathanael responds to that miracle with, "You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And that's what John is trying to do. He's trying to. That's the goal of that John is having here. He's trying to communicate also to other Jewish people, other Israelites who have no deceit. And he's trying to communicate to them 7 special signs that he hopes that by reading them, they will come to the same conclusion that Jesus is the Son of God and that he is the King of Israel. Okay. And so that's the whole purpose here. And Jesus actually tells Nathaniel, like, you're going to see greater things. And just like John speaking to his audience, like, this one story, I'm going to tell you about even greater things that he did. And he just walks straight into the story about the wedding and the miracle of turning water into wine, which we discussed yesterday. Now, after that happens, the Passover comes. And so, excuse me, so Jesus goes up to Jerusalem. Or it says went up to Jerusalem. It's south of where they are. But the reason why the language says goes up to Jerusalem is because you're climbing up into this mountain. It's a pilgrimage. You're going up to Jerusalem. And so he goes there and he sees that the places, the temple's been turned into a marketplace, and people are there's money changers and everything else. And he drives everyone. He makes a whip of cords and he drives everybody out. And he says, get these things out of here. Stop turning my father's house into a marketplace. Forgive me for that. I just had to clear my throat. And at this moment, the Jewish people, they respond by asking him, verse 18, what sign will you show for us doing these things, right? And there he responds with, destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. So when it says there, the Jews replied to him, and then again they replied that therefore the Jews said the temple took 46 years to build. It's important to know here, we talked about this yesterday, that the word that John used here is here the it's spelled in Greek Iudaiou. The Idu, now I forgot how to pronounce it. But that word is a reference to the Judean elite. So a lot of Bibles would translate it as the Jews, but it's believed to be a reference to the Judean elite. The Judean elite is a reference to the people like the Pharisees or the Sadducees, the ones that have established the rule of law through the religion, through the Jewish religion. And through the establishment of that law, they've become the elite. They're the ones that hold the rule books, and they're the ones that dictate what people should believe, and they're the ones who tell people they don't belong in the temple, or in the synagogue and the fellowship, which happens in chapter 9 when Jesus heals a man who was born from blind from birth, and Jesus heals him, and it's that Jewish elite that calls him in, and they're asking a bunch of questions, and they end up kicking him out. In today's terminology, similar to like excommunicating someone, they did that, and so they held this authority, right? They held this authority not only in Jerusalem but for all Jewish people throughout the region wherever their synagogues were established. And it's that crowd there that rejects him, right? Because they ask him for a sign. He tells them the only sign he's going to give them is the sign of his resurrection, which is why I kind of like to say that while traditionally, when looking at the Gospel of John, most people assign 7 signs to the Gospel of John, and we're certainly going to look at it that way. But Jesus mentions a sign here that's not numbered, and that's the sign of his resurrection. Okay, so that I believe is the 8th sign. But loosely translated, loosely applied, not saying that's a direct interpretation. We got to change all our commentaries, whatever. But I think that's just important to point out. But it's there, those people, those Jewish elite, okay, they're the ones who reject the idea that he's the King of Israel, that he's the Son of God. All right. And maybe wondering what does have to do with the miracle we saw. It's just the context is really important because this is why John is writing this, right? He's writing to the Samaritan Jewish people, the people in Galilee, the people that the other 3 Gospels kind of talked about Jesus healing people there, but then saying that they rejected him, right? So now he's trying to write a gospel for them to read, for them to see that they actually played a big role in Jesus' ascension in society up to the place where he then had to be crucified, because the Jewish elite, the Jewish leaders and the elite were worried about, his popularity, how he's growing, the disciples he was making, and that they are part of that narrative as well. Okay, that they're not just the enemies of the Messiah, but they were his followers, his disciples. So it's there at the end of chapter 2 when John then says that the many believed in his name. So Jesus stayed in Jerusalem, and many believed in his name, and they saw the signs they were doing. But notice that John throws this in at the end of chapter 2, verse 24. Jesus, however, would not entrust himself to them, since he knew them all, and because he did not need anyone to testify about man, for he himself knew what was in man. So there he's throwing in a little jab at the Judean elite, at the people in the south, and saying to his reader, who presumably is someone who's not there, who's out in the other parts of Israel, while there were some believing in him, Jesus didn't trust them completely. So just keep that in mind, okay? And later on in John chapter 6, certainly there's going to be some controversy. There's going to be some discussion about bread and his body being flesh and all this stuff, and people leaving him, and including Galilean Jews, by the way, that end up leaving him. But John is setting up this narrative again to speak about the dichotomy, the difference between those Jewish people who are not in Jerusalem, not part of the elite, and those who are. And then as the story continues, John chapter 3, a Pharisee who believes in him comes speaking to him. That's Nicodemus, and we're not going to go into that, but that just shows that John is showing, like, that there were some in the elite who believed in him, and Nicodemus was one of them. And then he moves on. He says that in verse 22 that he went to Judean countryside where he spent time with them, was baptizing people, and he actually says that his people weren't baptized, but that again, that he wasn't baptizing, his disciples were actually doing the baptizing. But again, there's some controversy here with the Judean elite. It says a dispute rose in verse 25 of chapter 3 between John's disciples and a Jew. That phrase, it means a Jewish elite, a Jewish a leader. It could have been a Pharisee, a Sadducee, or just someone who followed the way that the Sanhedrin should say, the combination of both. It's just the ruling house and party. It's kind of like saying Congress, Sanhedrin, made up of Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and Herodians, just different parties, political groups. But one of those from that group was arguing with them about purification. So again, it's about their rules and about their laws, about what they should be doing. John is highlighting again where the conflict is coming from. Who's not believing? It's that group that's not believing. It's not everybody. There are Jewish people in Jerusalem that are believing, following, and getting baptized. There are Jewish people in the northern parts in Galilee that are following him. And so the problem stands with the Jewish elite. And then when you get to chapter 4, you have the narrative about the Samaritan woman, right? And so that whole thing happens. Obviously, if you're talking to Samaritan Jews, this is where, like, the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they don't talk about the Samaritan woman at all. It's like that story doesn't exist, but John writes it. And that's why there's an idea, like, was there a fifth gospel Q, the original document that shared the story, and John got the story? I don't know. The reason why that becomes a topic is because there are people that disagree with the dating. John's written like a couple hundred years after Jesus is his time. So then, of course, like, were there any eyewitnesses left? But here, if we take this to be written early, this would be like by looking at this gospel as being written to Samaritan Jews and Galilean Jews, then we're looking at this gospel being written in 60 CE, which is even earlier than Luke, because Luke is written after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD or CE. So if we take that to be the perspective, it's an eyewitness, then it's just a story that John wanted to make sure he included to recognize again the importance of his audience to Jesus, into the idea that they can also believe in him as the Son of God and as the King of Israel. And so you have John chapter 4 go into that, and then that story of the Samaritan woman, and then it ends with the narrative we just read about the second sign and the healing of the official son. Now, I started in verse 43. And so it says, after 2 days, he left there. He left the Samaritan town for Galilee. And this is where the controversy, the seemingly, existence of a contradiction with the other three gospels comes into play. And that's verse 44 says, in parentheses, Jesus himself had testified the prophet has no honor in his own country. Now, in the other three gospels, that reference is to to Nazareth, to the place where Jesus was raised, um, not to the place that Jesus was born. And Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Jesus was born in Judea. We know that story. And so for John, it seems pretty clear that his own country and the people rejecting him are the Judeans. They're part of that Jewish elite, and that's John locating, centralizing Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. And the other three gospels, they cite this statement as taking place in Galilee and Nazareth, and about Jesus being rejected there. And certainly he was rejected there. They were like, didn't we know this kid from the time he was grown? Isn't this Joseph and Mary's son? Um, and so they rejected him. And that's where we see the quotation by Jesus that a prophet has no honor in his country. And so, yeah, contradiction, right? If you notice, though, the way that John's writing this, he doesn't say that Jesus specifically said that, or where Jesus is saying it and who he's speaking to. The other three gospels do that. What John is doing is he's taking something Jesus has said and he's applying it not only to the people in Galilee, but also to the people in Judea. And going back to John chapter 1, verse 11, that he went to his own and his own did not receive him. John is trying to add to the narrative, okay? Not trying to contradict it. He's trying to add to the narrative that it wasn't just the Galilean Jews who rejected Jesus, that it was also the Judean Jews who rejected Jesus. And certainly, like, the idea exists. We know that they're the ones, that the Pharisees and the leaders, they're the Sanhedrin, the high priest, that they're the ones who had Jesus arrested, and they're the ones that brought him before Pilate, right? Like, that doesn't escape us. But when you look at the narratives of the synoptics, sometimes it kind of went heavy-handed against the Galileans and that they were always rejecting him. But when you read it carefully, you see, that they were also believing. I mean, the feeding of the 5,000 that happened after John the Baptist was killed happened up in Galilee, and then you have the woman who was healed by touching Jesus's robe, and when Jesus went back to her hometown, like, all those people believing. And then you had the place where the guy had the demons cast out of him, and the pigs went in the water, and certainly, like, that, those people, like, were scared. They asked him to leave, but there's just, like, so many instances where Jesus both accepted and rejected. Okay. And I think what John is trying to do here is say, listen, it wasn't just the northern or the Galileans who rejected Jesus. It was also the Judeans. It was also his own people from the very beginning that rejected him. That's the narrative he's trying to tell here. And so in verse 45, he says, when they entered Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him because they had seen everything he did in Jerusalem during the festival. When we just looked at that, that's when he tied the cords up and he was chasing out the people from the temple. And so the Galileans had gone down for the festival, the Passover, which is important. Also for John to notice, like, or to point out, like, hey, you people you belong to the faith, you also you followed the law and you went down to Passover, you went down to the temple, and Jesus, when he was 12 years old, the same thing happened, right? He traveled down with a big caravan of people. So the idea is that the Galileans weren't just like some bad guys that rejected Jesus. The Galileans were people who from the beginning believed in Jesus, and what John is focusing on to as he's writing this gospel is is giving a source for the Galilean Jews, the Samaritan Jews, to be able to read a gospel and not feel like they're the bad guys the whole time. That they were also accepted, and that their people accepted Jesus, and that they can too accept Jesus. Okay, and that's why again this gospel stands out from the other three, because the message and the audience is so different. Uh, then um, then we have the narrative about the second sign. And if you remember, the signs talked about earlier, the signs have one purpose in John's gospel: to help the Israelite in whom there is no deceit, just like Nathaniel. Nathaniel is kind of a case study, a representation of everybody John is writing to. A sign for them to see and to believe then that Jesus is the Son of God and that he is the King of Israel. And so you have a royal official, according to the Christian Standard Version, the version we read here, the Tree of Life version. Let's see, it's in verse 46. Says there was a nobleman whose son was sick in Capernaum. So it was somebody that was high up the ranking. If you notice that the narrative tells us that he went back to Cana, and Cana was where the wine turned into water, miracle happened. And you can assume, I think we can safely assume, that a royal official, a nobleman, was probably at this wedding, right? And it's usually the kind of thing you do, especially in Middle East, Eastern countries. If you can get someone high up to come, like, you invite them and they come out to the wedding. So I don't have any problem. There's nothing to tell us that, but I have no problem assuming that this guy was at the wedding, and because of that, or at least he knew people that were there, right? um, and and because of that connection, he knew what Jesus was capable of doing, and he had just been waiting. Um, Sorry, he's from Capernaum, so he went to Cana to meet Jesus there. And Capernaum was the hometown of Peter, and Jesus did a lot of miracles there too. So either he heard about the wedding, or he heard about Jesus somehow. But it says in verse 47, when the man heard that Jesus had come from Judea into Galilee, he went to go plead with him. So ultimately, this is the point, right? So I don't know again now if he was there at the wedding or if he was just there. But it's obvious here that uh, Jesus had gone down to the south, to Judea. This people were aware of it. Hey, the miracle that he performed, the water turning into wine, everything else he'd been doing. If we look at the synoptics, he's down in Judea now. Then his son gets sick. Then he hears that Jesus has returned. Okay, and so he goes to meet Jesus in Cana, and it's there where he pleads with him to heal his son. So it's important to notice here that while Jesus says, like, man, unless you see signs and wonders, you do not believe. There is something though that he believes in. I think for him to seek out Jesus, it's like the woman who was healed from bleeding for 12 years. She went up. She also went into from she went from her place up to Capernaum. So she traveled to go be healed, and so his name had spread around the region what he'd been able to do. Now she touched him. She touched him. She needed something. She touched him. What's interesting though is that Jesus isn't talking about his faith in terms of getting a miracle done. If the guy believes, he's just talking about the need for signs for them to believe that he truly is the Son of God, that he is the King of Israel. Right? That's kind of what he's saying there in verse 48. Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And and the official's just like, okay, yeah, but I need you to come and heal my son. So he obviously has faith that Jesus can do something, that Jesus at least is a healer, which I mentioned yesterday wasn't an uncommon thing. There were healers at the time before Jesus. There were healers there. So there were people who did these kinds of miracles. But this isn't about the healing. This is about believing that he is the Son of God, that he is the King of Israel. And what happens here that is presumably unique from any other healer or healings that would be done, is that Jesus was able to do it without having to go and see the kid or see the son. I'm assuming he's a boy because it says son. My son is sick. He could be a grown guy, father would still be concerned about that. And so Jesus tells him, like, go, your son will live. And then the narrative tells us that at the exact same moment of the day when Jesus said, your son will live, is the exact same moment, according to the servants that were there with the boy while he was sick. It was the exact same moment he was healed. And that's where it's the sign, the sign that's there's a sign for the Galilean Jew, the Samaritan Jew, to read this, and maybe even the Southern Jew, the Jain Jewish person who's reading this narrative, who's like, oh, there's another gospel job about Jesus. Let me go ahead and read this. Also, let me go listen to it be read. And so here's a story. It's like, wow, at the same moment Jesus said, okay, your son will be okay. It was the same moment he was healed. And in verse 54, it closes as, now this is the second sign Jesus performed after he came from Judea to Galilee. And it's interesting here for me to point out, John is writing and he's saying, these are the signs. You need signs to believe. This is what happened. This is what I saw. This is what I experienced. This is what happened. But in between all that, he also tells the story about the Samaritan woman. And I just wanted to point out in verse 39 of chapter 4, it reads, now many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of what the woman said when she testified. He told me everything I ever did. So there you have Samaritans believing simply because of a testimony. He knew that I done all this stuff and everything else, and so the people were like, wow, that's great, and they believed. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there for 2 days. Many more believed because of what he said. And they told the woman, we no longer believe because of what you said, but because we have heard for ourselves and know this is really the Savior of the world. What's interesting here, the juxtaposition of these two stories, narratives, and now even the wedding at Cana. And then you also have Nicodemus. Nicodemus had a hard time believing. Nicodemus is from the Pharisees, from that Jewish elite, the people that John is saying has rejected Jesus. And Nicodemus had a hard time accepting, understanding what Jesus was saying. Jesus is like, you got to be born again. He's like, what do you mean I got to be born again? And here you have a Samaritan woman, someone who's looked down on because she's had 5 husbands, she's been with 5 different men, and so she's looked down on, not only because of what she's done, but because of who she is. She's a Samaritan, she's a woman. That's like all compounding factors against us. And yet, just in the simple conversation she has with Jesus, she believes, right? As opposed to the leader and teacher from the Pharisees and Nicodemus, which, to his credit, he eventually does become a follower and believer of Jesus, but it's a little harder for him. For her, she believed. And her testimony led to her sharing with others in her town. And because of that testimony, they also believed. But then they went to go talk to Jesus themselves. And notice it doesn't say that he performed any miracles with them. They just talked to him. Scroll back up to that passage. It says, in verse 42, it's no longer because of your words that we believe. We've heard for ourselves. Now we know this is really the Savior of the world. And I would love to have a recording of what he was teaching them, what he was talking about, what he was sharing. But it just notice that John doesn't say he performed any miracles there, that he was healing. In the synoptics, they mention that all the time. And he stayed there many days and healed them and healed the sick and healed the blind or whatever. But just seems to be about the testimony, the talking and the teaching that Jesus is doing. And it was enough for them to believe, many of them to believe. And then that's juxtaposed with the Galileans who saw him clear out the temple and they believed. And then you have to have then you have this guy who needs to have a sign, or he speaks to the people that need a sign, right? And I think, and what John is doing, he's willing to provide examples of everything. And so for his reader's looking at it and says, wow, those people believed and based on what he was teaching. And so I need to focus on what he's teaching and see. And so if you go back into John chapter 4 and you look at what Jesus is teaching, and he says, believe me, woman, an hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, right? And he says, "You Samaritans worship what you don't know. We worship what we do know, because salvation is from the Jews, from this holding this idea of the Messiah coming from the Davidic line." And that was just him referring to the fact that they didn't believe in that, right? He's saying this is what's going to happen. And so you can imagine that's what he was explaining to them. He's maybe going through the scriptures and teaching them and saying, "Listen, I know you guys have kind of established your own way, your own worship, but salvation does come from the Davidic dynasty, and let me explain to you how that works. And but just so you know, we're not going to have to go. You're not going to have to leave your place and go worship at the temple now. You can be able, verse 23, you can worship the Father in spirit and truth." And that's what God wants, to worship Him in spirit and truth. And so that you can imagine that that's what He's teaching, that's what He's expounding on, because now they've heard it themselves. They believe in Him as the Messiah. And if you need a sign, then you have the story about the official. And so John in his narrative is giving us, and then he's going to continue with the third sign about a man being healed in Jerusalem, okay, which is what we'll talk about tomorrow. And just for us as an application, uh, I, I failed to mention this yesterday. There's a really good example here of what it means to be spiritually abused by religious leaders, right? And that's the Samaritan Jewish people. That's the Galilean Jewish people. Whether the Jewish elite, the leaders were right, the Judean leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, whether they were right or wrong doesn't really matter in this context. Yeah, they had it right that the Messiah would come from the Davidic line, but their way of treating others who didn't fall into their rules and their way of worship and their way of sacrifices and what they're supposed to do to meet with God. The way that they did that, they shamed people and they excluded people and they excommunicated people, would excommunicate people as they do, like I said earlier in John chapter 9. That was their approach. Like, you don't fit into our story, you don't follow our narratives, so we're going to just toss you out. We're going to label you as outside the place. And um, what John's doing here in his gospel is he understands that. And so he's writing a gospel that's trying to appeal to the ones that have been excluded for so long, knowing that because the other synoptics, I mean, they're great. They're great gospels, and the stories in Matthew, especially, I love studying Matthew. He just understands that in reading Matthew and reading Luke and Mark, there's a possibility that the Samaritan Jew, and it's probably already been happening, right? And like I said, Luke didn't exist yet, so it's like if we take the early authorship here, so it's really about Mark and Matthew, because they read that and maybe you've experienced like Samaritan Jews saying, I don't want to read that story. They just talk about how much we rejected him, and that's just not true. Maybe they experienced it. They were there. They're like, man, they're writing like how we didn't accept him, we didn't welcome him, and it's not how it was here. Imagine that going on, and John's like, hey, you know what? I got to write a story. I got to write a version of this gospel that is a little more balanced. And I think that's actually what he's doing here. He's showing a little balance. He's showing rejection from both sides. It's going to get there a little more with the Galileans, and acceptance from both sides, and in the importance of both sides, and how Jesus is healing and performing miracles on both sides, right? And it's not just this one-sided kind of thing where the Jewish people, the Judean elite only affected things at the end. Although I don't think that's also what happens either, right? It's just kind of like what can be the perspective when you've been abused by a system and then you read it. And I really like how John approaches this and says, I want to provide something that's going to help the abused to kind of be at peace. And I think for in terms of like mental health and scriptures and so on and so forth, the main the one of the concepts here, mental health and scriptures, uh, is that I've come across people too that have been spiritually abused by their religious leaders. And so when it comes to reading the Bible, just reading the Bible in general, they have a really hard time opening up the scriptures. And it makes me sad because I love reading the scriptures. I love studying the scriptures. I think by reading the scriptures, we allow the Spirit of God to speak to us and to enliven us to his presence and to his mind and the way he works in his truth. And John's purpose of this gospel is for us to know that he is that Jesus is the Son of God, and that he is the King of Israel. And in chapter 17, verse 3, is also to experience eternal life, to know God, and the one who sent him, who sent Jesus, to know him. And so, but I understand it, and I understand that struggle that comes there. And so, I hope that we can we can look at this and see what it means for someone to take the time to understand someone else's pain and their struggles, and to then reach out and communicate in a way that'll hopefully bless them with the knowledge you should be blessed in, and not allowing the pain from the past to be a block in their ability to understand, right? And so that's where Mark and Matthew might have lacked a little bit in their sensitivity to that problem. That's why the Gospel of John was written this way. That's what I believe, and I agree with the commentator of let me get his name right. It's a hyphenated name. So Eli Lazorkin Eisenberg, the one who wrote the Jewish Gospel of John, discovering Jesus, King of all Israel. I really like this perspective that he shares in this commentary, because I think it really does help explain. Like I said, he was somebody. This isn't a problem just existed back in the day. He is somebody who felt, as a Jewish person, that the Gospel of John was anti-Jewish because of the way English translations present the Jewish people, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. But as he's writing this as a Jewish person, he's realizing it's not about the Jews, rejecting Jesus. It's about the Judeans. And so he's himself is trying to come forward and say, I don't want to read or keep avoiding the Gospel of John because it makes me feel like Christianity hates me. And that's really not the point of the Gospel of John. It's not that. It's about how everybody accepted him, everybody rejected him, and that there's a place for both, and that the goal is in the Gospel of John for the Jewish person to understand that they aren't the enemy of God, that it's just the people who wish to control narratives who are the enemies of God, right? And that's my hope too, through the ministry here, is that for you watch this who have experienced spiritual abuse to know that abuse did not come from God. Who knows why God allows certain people to be shepherds and elders and deacons and pastors and whatever it might be, the labeled bishops. They're there, and they abuse and they hurt. And the Father doesn't. He understands how that keeps people from Him, and He doesn't want that to be okay. And so He's put people like me. I've worked with a lot of spiritually abused over my career, but this as a professor with students, and then just like through social media or whatever. And I know this is reaching people like that. I know on my social media I've got people who've had that history. And just like, what, God is safe. God is safe. We just have to find the safe people that He has out there, and be looking for them, and try not to close ourselves off to the places where we might be able to find them. So anyway, that's what I have for this morning, and I pray that this was a blessing and this helps us all to further grow in the knowledge of Him. And whether we need the signs or we just need the teachings, we just to understand ultimately that Jesus is the Son of God, and that He is the King of Israel, and that He is also now, the King of the world. Really, as a Gentile, I have been accepted into that kingdom, and it makes me feel great, and I can't wait to see Him establish Himself on this earth, and so that we can go to Him for our teaching and don't have to uh, be so distant, but also so close. I thank you for listening. I remind you that this evening we will be streaming in at 6 o'clock here on Twitch. We may still be playing Ratchet and Clank. I'll see what my daughter's up to, but we'll be trying to talk about some of this material in more practical application and sense. Thank you.